All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Ed Tarnowski, State Policy Associate at Ed Choice. Welcome to the Free the Economy, Ed.
Thank you so much for having me, Richard.
So we're going to talk about school choice, educational opportunity, and all that great stuff. But to start with, just give us a quick description of your organization, Ed Choice, and what your mission is.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ed Choice is the intellectual legacy of Milton and Rose Friedman. That is Milton Friedman and his wife. Um, and the organization's purpose is advocating for school choice for as many families as as an expansive as a way as possible. The idea of money following the child.
That's great. Now, we've seen a lot of movement in school choice politics just in the last couple of years or so. So we've had some new legal policy changes in several different states. How big of a trend are we riding here?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a massive year for the school choice movement. And we're really calling it the year of universal choice. And it certainly is. Just to put that into perspective, this year alone, we've seen seven new universal programs. That means seven states either expanded a program to be universal or created a new universal program. That is in Iowa, Utah, Arkansas, Florida, Indiana, Oklahoma, and Ohio. Now, I will add one caveat. Indiana, we're calling near universal. It is very close. It's about 97% eligibility. So it's pretty much in the same category. It's very close. So I will include Indiana there. They did have their expansion, and they deserve the recognition.
But yeah, you describe some states as having a universal or a full program. Obviously, that means there's some states that have sort of more partial programs. So in this journey from having a state where you're only ever allowed to go to a public school, a traditional state-run school, to a like full universal program, what are the kind of steps along the way that some other states have?
Yeah, so over the course of history of school choice, a lot of states for years did take that kind of incremental approach, and some states still are, where they'll start with maybe a program based on income, basically limiting eligibility based on a certain income level. Usually that is either by percentage of the federal poverty line. Sometimes that's percentage of the free and reduced lunch program. For instance, New Hampshire just expanded its program this year. It's an education savings account from 300% to 350% of the federal poverty line. So they're taking an incremental approach up there, for instance.
So
But
that's the total, the household income for the parents. The
you have
lower the
combined
income,
family income.
yeah, the lower the income, the more likely you would be to be eligible.
That's correct. That's one way. Some other states have started with just allowing for special needs or other special groups and things of that nature. It really does vary by state. Federalism always makes things interesting. So we definitely see a lot of variation of programs over the years.
So now this all seems like it would be something that would be uncontroversial to me, but of course, there's a lot of pushback to school choice movement and of the movement to reform public education in general. Uh, what role are the teachers unions playing here? I guess that's mostly the National Education Association and the National Federation of Teachers, kind of two big national unions.
I mean, we've definitely seen some opposition, a lot of opposition from unions on this issue. What we do find is we actually at Choice does a ton of polling, and what we actually find is teachers actually like a lot of teachers actually like school choice. And teachers really are different from the unions. And I think a lot of people do sometimes we'll lump them in together, but teachers are really different from the unions. And we actually do find that, yeah, a lot of teachers are in favor of school choice, especially when the definition of choice is expanded on. But yeah, the unions they've definitely been in opposition to school choice for many years. That's for a varying number of reasons. However, we know the data is on the side of school choice, and we know that we're doing the right thing.
All right. Now, we've also been seeing a lot of controversy over things like, as has sort of always been the case, but I feel like it's heated up more in the past year or two. Things like sex education and books and instructional materials and classes, and some parents have objected to. And I wonder, there's that's maybe like the most hot button part aspect of this, but there's always debates among different groups of parents about what's appropriate at what ages and what instructional environments. And I wonder if school choice is potentially a way out of some of those like heated conflicts, because it seems like if we had more diversity, more independent schools with their own standards, the parents could sort of navigate to them with sort of like vouchers and things like that. Then you could have, certainly in larger cities and towns, you could have multiple schools with different philosophies, and so you could have one with that was more permissive or one that was more conservative. And if we had those varieties, you wouldn't have to fight at every school board meeting. You wouldn't have to fight in every like state department of education over one standard, because different parents could have different standards.
Yeah, that's a great question. The beauty of school choice is empowering families to make the decision that they know is best for their family. Um, Whether that could be for a number of reasons. Each kid has different educational needs, and oftentimes families will want their kids to be educated in a way that meets their values. Whether that's from left or right, religious or non-religious. The beauty of choice is it empowers families to make the decisions that are best for them, rather than government bureaucrats making those decisions for them with instructional materials or varying other factors.
It's interesting to think about how the cultural meaning of school choice has sort of changed over the years, sort of cultural affiliation. I think I was recently doing a research project about the early 1970s and the change in economic policy, but I was reading a lot about sort of, social attitudes and trends at the time. And I feel like if you talk to a parent who felt really strongly about opting their child out of mainstream public education 50 years ago, that person would probably be a hippie, right? At the time, a lot of people thought public schools were part of the conformist establishment, and that if you wanted your kid to be in a sort of free-thinking, socially progressive place, you would want them to be in some alternative school, right? Not in a mainstream government school. But now it seems, we've sort of alluded to already, it seems like there's a subset of Americans who think of public schools as, dangerously left wing, and rather than part of this, sort of conformist establishment. Uh, so that you have more, uh, certainly what I've been hearing, more socially conservative parents wanting to opt their kids out of, mainstream public schools. So I wonder if those sort of cultural associations influence this public school debate about whether you think, if you think public schools are generally right wing, you'll have one opinion. If you think they're generally centrist and non-controversial, think another way. And if you think they've somehow become left wing, then you'll have a different view of this.
No, so it's interesting you mentioned that. EdChoice does monthly polling, and one of the interesting findings that we see month to month is just when polling people who identify as Democrat or Republican, we actually find almost the same percentage of both Republicans and Democrats in favor of education savings accounts. And we see large majorities across other demographic groups as well. So I think what we're seeing here is I think the pandemic really, and it was increasing a little bit before the pandemic, the polling on this, but I think the pandemic truly was a turning point. I think a lot of families were I think there are two main pillars of why the pandemic had such an impact. I think one, a lot of families saw their kids having Zoom school from home. They saw more of what was going on in the classroom. They didn't necessarily like that. And two, school closures. There was a lot of frustration with how it was impacting their kids learning, how it led to a lot of learning loss, and things of that nature. So it's been really interesting to see how school choice has really become mainstream more than ever in the last few years across demographic groups.
Hmm. You know, one thing I hear a lot about school vouchers is a sort of like common talking point I hear. is that, tax money, taxpayer money that was intended to go to public schools should only go to government operated schools and not to say like independent charter schools, for example, and that money should only stay in the government system. But that seems like kind of the opposite way most of our government benefits work. Like, you don't have to spend your SNAP credit, what people used to call food stamps, your food assistance credit. You don't have to spend that at a government-owned supermarket, right? You don't have to, so you don't have to spend it at the supermarket that happens to be closest to your house, right? With certain limitations, you can use that funds, that money any way you want. And doesn't seems to me like that education spending could operate on the same standpoint.
So firstly, I think we need to start thinking about this differently. Firstly, the money doesn't belong to those districts necessarily. The idea is that the money is for educating children. So that money, we believe, should really follow the child. Two, we have a lot of data on this. If you look at states that have had varying choice options for years, for instance, Florida, during Jeb Bush's era, he brought in some school choice and beyond that. Adjusting to inflation, Florida has seen massive increases in education funding for public education. So I think the idea that school choice is going to be siphoning money away from public schools or really causing a hit on funding towards public schools, the data just hasn't shown that. And what we've seen state to state, so this talking point, we do hear it a lot, and we just don't see it as accurate.
So, we've covered some angles about why parents and even the rest of society, might profit from school choice. But as someone who's a big fan of market economics, it seems to me one of the most important things is increased competition. Doesn't seem like it's any big system, any institution of any kind that enjoys a sort of functional monopoly, as the government schools did, public schools did for a long time in a lot of places, is going to have the incentives to increase quality or minimize costs over time, and that a sort of robust school choice environment is the only thing, since most of these, even in the future of great educational choice, relatively few of these are going to be for-profit schools. Almost all of them are going to be nonprofit entities in one way or another, like most private schools have always been. That competition between them then is the only way you're going to get any sort of incentive to continually improve.
So there are a lot of accusations thrown out by anti-school choice folks. One of them being they'll accuse school choice proponents of being against public schools. But this simply isn't the case. In fact, what we've seen with the data is school choice has actually improved public schools and private schools. So there have been 28 empirical studies on the impact of school choice when school choice is introduced into a community, what the impact has been on students who have remained in their public schools. 25 of those have actually found positive effects on the students remaining in public schools. So what we are finding is school choice, more opportunity, really does introduce more competition into that marketplace. And just like in any other industry we've seen over decades, free enterprise has been more effective at innovation and improving things than any system in the history of the world. And Milton Friedman's idea was always applying that to education. And what we see is so far with the data is that he was absolutely right. School choice improves public, private, charter, and beyond.
So I wonder, have you done comparisons sort of internationally as well, of other similar tier countries, developed countries? How do their education systems compare to the U.S. and do they have? I guess I always imagine that the United States is going to be more individualistic than some other countries. So I would imagine we would be leading on school choice. But what kind of comparisons have you seen there?
So you bring up international. So there is a statistic I have to bring up that we found that was very interesting throughout the pandemic. So in Sweden, for those who don't know, Sweden actually kept their schools open during the pandemic, instead opting for rather than blanket school closures, they went more toward kind of quarantine where necessary and things of that nature. And so there was the International Journal of Educational Research actually found that there was no reading learning loss among students in those schools. Compared to the US, where reading scores have regressed back to 1992 levels, and math scores have regressed back to I don't want to get the stat wrong. Where reading scores have regressed back to 1992 levels and math scores have regressed back to 2003 levels. That's data by the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So there is something to make a comparison to internationally, especially in terms of the reading loss and learning loss in general from the pandemic. And I think Sweden is one of those examples to look at.
So, we've talked about how we've seen a big year just recently for changes in states and states going to more universal choice systems. How much progress do we think is possible over the next few years? Because in some of these cases, uh, on especially in some of these state by state policies, I feel like when you see good progress, sometimes that's sort of like the low hanging fruit. That's sort of the states where it was easiest to pass it, and so it becomes harder because those are the states where it's more controversial. Whereas in sometimes it's sort of like a snowball effect. The more states adopt a certain policy, the easier it is because then of course it's seen as the reasonable thing to do. It's seen as having momentum, um, and so maybe depending on the exact issue, there might be a little bit of both at issue. Um, but but given the success that we've seen most recently, what do you think the progress is for like the next several states hopefully improving?
Yeah, this is really important to discuss going forward. We've had a lot of progress, but there is still a lot of work to do. One state I will mention is Wyoming. What we actually saw is um, a universal program passed one chamber. It passed the Senate. In the House, the majority of the members in the House had signed on to sponsor this bill. But the speaker unilaterally decided he just wasn't going to hear it. There wouldn't be a vote on it. So it was ready to go. It was going to pass. It was going to be enacted. But the speaker just unilaterally made that decision for them that they would not have that vote and that Wyoming would not have school choice that year. So it's going to be interesting to see in a state like Wyoming, with so much pressure and so much support for choice, how that progresses going forward. There's some other states I mentioned as well. There is, I believe, starting to be a crack in the anti-school choice wall, I'll say. There's still a long way to go. So I won't get ahead of myself. However, you've seen, for instance, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, the governor, he came out in support on the campaign of lifeline scholarships. He came out in support of an ESA program. Unfortunately, in the end, as we just saw at the end of session, he was supporting it throughout the session. It seemed like it was ready to go. And when it came down to final negotiations, ultimately he did end up saying that he would line out and veto that proposal to get the budget through. However, the fact that we now see some Democrats who have traditionally not been in support of school choice beginning to even campaign on it, that still shows that they sense the pressure on the ground among voters and constituents. And this is something to really watch going forward, as I do believe there's a serious disconnect between Democratic politicians and Democratic voters on school choice.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. So, with any big policy fight like this, obviously you need to put together a sort of coalition of supporters. Sometimes that creates a sort of like strange bedfellows where people aren't used to working together, but maybe they work together just on this one issue. And I know, I've been around to plenty of conferences and conventions and uh, uh, political jamborees where school choice people are there in surrounded by people of varying political parties and political persuasions. So, I know a lot of our friends in the State Policy Network, the network of state think tanks across the country. have been a lot of them have been active in school choice issues in the past. Previous episode, we had a friend of ours from North Carolina, from the John Locke Foundation, and we've often talked about how people who work on state level policy, collaborate together, work and help each other out. So, what what can you tell me about the sort of like coalition of people? Not everyone who supports school choice is someone for whom school choice is their number one full-time issue, right?
Sure. So do you mean more of voters or more in the think tank world? What exactly are you looking at?
Any of these, other sort of like organizations, I feel like, because we know, like you said, you see in the polling that both Democrats and Republicans, a lot of people with both party affiliations do support things like education savings accounts, whatnot. But sort of organizational, institutional allies.
Sure. I mean, we've definitely seen more than ever in the last few years. We like to joke at EdChoice. So when we were first getting started, before I was born, back in the 90s, oftentimes EdChoice folks would attend a lot of these conferences, and the school choice people were kind of just like they were a very small contingent in the movement. And now what I've seen attending many of the same conferences as you, school choice is the number one issue, often time and time again at these conferences that people are talking about, that speakers are focusing on. I really do think it's becoming the issue of our time.
And to me, it seems like one, an issue that's important in and of itself, but also I think a lot of people have said, well, this is the way that the entire country is going to improve. This is the way the next generation is going to find better jobs. This is, that it's obviously valuable to have choices when you want to figure out where your kid's going to go to school, but laying the foundation of the best possible education is also the key to all sorts of other big stuff downstream.
Absolutely, and that's so important, and that's why this issue I think is becoming more important than ever as we see some of the devastating data coming out of the pandemic on public schools. A lot of kids just feel like they're being left behind. A lot of families feel like they're being left behind. And if choice can change that, then it can really change a whole life. Think about if you're a family where your kid they're going to school, they're trying their hardest, they're just falling behind. Maybe they have different needs than some of the other kids around them. This idea that has really persisted for so long, that the one size fits all system works for everyone. I think that's really breaking apart. We've seen a lot of families in that situation I described. They're given a new opportunity through school choice to go to a different school. Oftentimes they find it just meets their needs better, and they see their child thriving more than ever. And that's going to set them up for a lifelong of opportunities that they might have not had otherwise if they continue to fall behind in their current school.
All right. Well, that sounds like a very important fight. I'm glad you guys have been having so much success so far, and we look forward to keeping track of future successes as well. And just tell us where can we find all the EdChoice material, and where can we find you online?
Absolutely. So EdChoice has a wealth of information on our website, edchoice.org. And of course, make sure to follow me on Twitter personally at Tarnowski, where Richard and I often do have conversations out there about school choice and about other issues as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.